In a small town where whispers of prejudice and division hung thick in the air, the notion of change seemed impossible. For years, the community had been ruled by hatred, where the color of one's skin determined where they could sit, who they could befriend, and even if they could walk down certain streets. But then one person, one figure, rode in, changing everything. He wasn't a politician or a celebrity, but a figure that would come to be known as the Black Rider. On the surface, he seemed like just another man, maybe even an outsider, but the impact he had would shake the very foundations of this town. His mission wasn't about starting a revolution. It was about one thing: unity. It wasn't something he came into the community with a megaphone shouting about. No, he did it by showing up when no one expected him, standing up when others cowered, and proving that true strength lies in community, not division. But before the Black Rider arrived, the town was stuck in its ways. Generations of racism had carved deep roots, and anyone who dared to speak out was met with hostility or worse. It was a place where people kept their heads down, avoiding the friction that bubbled beneath the surface. They didn't realize how much hatred they were carrying with them, how much they were hurting themselves and others by staying silent. And it seemed like nothing could break that cycle, nothing could disrupt the way things were. Then the Black Rider showed up one afternoon. He was an enigma, neither man nor myth, but someone whose presence commanded attention. No one knew where he came from or why he decided to ride through the town. Some thought he was just passing by. Others thought he was lost. But his purpose became clear when he stopped in front of the town's community center, where year after year there had been the same bitter arguments, the same exclusionary practices. No one could have predicted that one man, just a man on a horse, could spark such a profound change. At first, the people of the town were skeptical. Some even laughed at the idea that this stranger could change anything. They didn't see what was coming. But it didn't take long for the Black Rider to become more than just a figure. They realized he was speaking a language they understood. It wasn't about fighting violence with more violence. It wasn't about shouting or forcing anyone to believe something they didn't want to believe. No, the Black Rider's weapon was something more powerful: kindness, understanding, and a relentless dedication to breaking down the walls that had been built between them. His journey wasn't easy. The resistance he met was fierce. The town was set in its ways, and every inch he gained in breaking down the walls of hatred was hard-won. He wasn't met with open arms at first. In fact, many tried to push him out, to remind him that this was their town, and it wasn't his place to challenge the order they had so long upheld. The Black Rider wasn't trying to destroy what they had. He was just trying to build something new, something better. It was on one cold evening, when the sky hung heavy with the threat of a storm, that something truly remarkable happened. The Black Rider stood before a group of residents who had long been known for their intolerance. With quiet resolve, he spoke of unity, of shared experiences, of the undeniable truth that in the end, they were all more alike than they were different. He didn't shout. He didn't force his message. He simply said, "We are all human. We are all deserving of kindness, and we all deserve the chance to be better." The reaction was mixed. Some in the crowd stood silent, caught in the power of his words, while others clenched their fists in defiance. A few even laughed. But the Black Rider wasn't done yet. He knew he had to show them, not just tell them. That was the turning point. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. The next day, he arrived at the town square, where a long-standing tradition of exclusion was taking place. The community had always drawn a line in the sand. Those on one side were accepted, those on the other rejected. The Black Rider, though, walked right into the middle of that line, unafraid of the glares and whispers that followed. He simply sat there, in the center of it all, waiting. He wasn't demanding that anyone change. He wasn't asking for anything except an open heart and an open mind. It was there, in that quiet moment, that something shifted. People began to approach him, cautiously at first, then more freely. They didn't understand why he was doing this or what he hoped to accomplish, but they couldn't ignore the sincerity in his eyes. The Black Rider wasn't trying to prove he was right. He was just proving that change was possible, that it was within them all. But the battle wasn't over. For every person who began to question their own beliefs, there was another who felt threatened, who saw his presence as a challenge to everything they knew. The Black Rider had made some allies, but he'd also made enemies. Those who felt their power was slipping, those who refused to acknowledge the common humanity they shared with him and others like him. And so, the story hangs in the balance. Will the Black Rider succeed in uniting a divided town, or will the forces of hatred prove too strong? Will the seeds of unity he's planted take root, or will they be crushed under the weight of long-held prejudices? To find out how the Black Rider's journey unfolds, and whether he can truly inspire the change this community so desperately needs, stay tuned for the next part of this story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The days that followed the Black Rider's arrival were filled with tension. The town, which had lived in an uneasy silence for so long, now found itself at a crossroads. The community members who had once remained hidden behind walls of distrust and hate were suddenly forced to confront the truth. This stranger, this Black Rider, wasn't just challenging their beliefs. He was giving them an opportunity. An opportunity they hadn't realized they needed. But not everyone saw it that way. Among the town's oldest residents, the most entrenched in their ways, there was a deep sense of discomfort. For them, change was a threat, a sign of weakness. They had built their lives around the idea that certain people were better than others, and they weren't ready to give that up. The Black Rider represented everything they feared. The disruption of their carefully constructed world, the erosion of the power they had held for so long. In the midst of this brewing storm, the Black Rider continued his quiet work. His name wasn't important, and perhaps that's why he had become so powerful. No one knew where he came from or what had driven him to this remote town. All they knew was that he was here, asking nothing but for people to see each other, not as us and them, but as equals. It wasn't a message that could be forced, nor one that could be ignored. The town's mayor, Thomas Reynolds, had always been a man of tradition. He had inherited his position from his father and his grandfather before him, and for decades he had maintained the status quo. He was respected by many in the community, but it was clear that his authority was being challenged. Reynolds had heard the rumors, seen the subtle shifts in the people around him. People were beginning to question the way things had always been. And as much as he wanted to dismiss the Black Rider as a passing curiosity, he couldn't ignore the stirrings of unrest in the town. Reynolds had spent years protecting the town's legacy, but now he found himself at a crossroads. He knew that the community was divided, and there was no easy solution. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was losing control. But he wasn't the only one who had concerns. His wife, Margaret, had always been more progressive. She believed in fairness, in justice for all. She had often pushed him to make the town more inclusive, to build bridges rather than walls. But she knew better than to press him too hard. Now, as the town became more divided, she found herself torn. She saw what the Black Rider was trying to do, and yet she knew the opposition he faced would be formidable. Meanwhile, in the streets, something was happening. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to change. A woman named Clara, a lifelong resident of the town, had always believed that things were simply the way they were. Racism, prejudice, and separation were just a part of life. She had raised her children with the same beliefs her parents had passed down to her. But as she watched the Black Rider continue his quiet crusade for unity, something inside her began to shift. She started talking to her neighbors, engaging in conversations she had never dared before. She didn't know if she could change everything overnight, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the same way. It wasn't just Clara. There were others, silent allies, people who had been afraid to speak out for years, who were now starting to question their own biases. They began to gather in small groups, discussing the possibility of a new future, one where they could be open and honest with each other, one where they could put aside old wounds and start healing. They were afraid, of course. Afraid of the backlash, afraid of what would happen if they stepped out of line. But they couldn't ignore the feeling of hope that had slowly started to grow inside them. But the Black Rider wasn't just a symbol of hope for some. To others, he was a threat. A group of young men, led by a man named Vince, had always been at the heart of the town's most dangerous beliefs. They had grown up in a world of hostility, and they were determined to keep it that way. Vince had seen the Black Rider's efforts as a challenge to everything he had been taught, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He began organizing rallies, calling on the town's most resistant voices to join him in taking a stand against the change that was sweeping through. As the tension reached a boiling point, the Black Rider found himself at the center of a fierce showdown. The mayor, sensing the growing chaos, called a town meeting. It was time for the community to face its demons head-on, to decide once and for all whether they would choose unity or division. The Black Rider was invited to speak, though many knew he would be met with hostility. The night of the meeting, the town hall was packed. Every seat was filled with anxious faces, some hopeful, some fearful. The air was thick with anticipation. The Black Rider entered quietly, his presence commanding respect. He didn't say much at first, instead simply standing before the crowd, allowing them to take in his calm, unwavering stance. Then he spoke. "You all have the power to choose what kind of community you want to be," he said softly, his voice carrying through the room. "You can continue to live in fear, or you can rise above it. The choice is yours." His words hung in the air like a challenge. On one side, there were those who believed in his message, those who had already begun to change. But on the other side, Vince and his followers were ready to fight for what they believed was the town's identity. The tension in the room was palpable, thick as smoke, and for a moment, it felt like the entire town was holding its breath. What happened next would change everything. But would it be enough to overcome the deep divide? Would the Black Rider's message of hope survive the storm that was coming? The town was about to face its greatest test, and no one knew how it would end. The room was electric with tension as the Black Rider stood silently in front of the town hall, facing a sea of eyes that ranged from skeptical to hostile. On one side, Vince and his followers exchanged quiet but fiery words, clearly preparing for what they believed would be a final showdown. On the other side, the small group of people who had started to believe in change, Clara, Margaret, and a few others, watched anxiously, knowing that this moment could either break the cycle of hate or deepen the rift forever. For a moment, it seemed like everything would erupt. Vince stood, his face flushed with anger, his voice rising as he rallied the people who feared change. He spoke of tradition, of preserving what the town had always been, of the way things were supposed to be. His words were harsh, laced with bitterness, and they cut through the room like a knife. But then the Black Rider did something no one expected. He stepped forward and placed a hand on the edge of the podium, his calm presence filling the room like a quiet storm. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice steady and warm. "But fear has never been the solution. Fear has only built walls between us. And walls don't protect us. They isolate us." The crowd fell silent. It wasn't that they agreed immediately. But for the first time, they saw a side of the Black Rider they hadn't noticed before. Not just strength, but vulnerability. He wasn't here to destroy their history. He was here to remind them that their shared humanity was more important than their differences. Then something remarkable happened. Clara, the woman who had quietly begun questioning her long-held beliefs, stood up. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew something had to change. With trembling hands, she spoke. "I used to think things couldn't be different," Clara said, her voice cracking slightly, but strong. "I thought we had to keep things the way they were because that's how it's always been. But I've seen enough. We can't keep hiding from each other. We can't keep ignoring the truth." Her words were a loud declaration. They weren't the speeches of a politician. They were the quiet cry of someone who had seen the damage of hate and had finally decided it was time to stand up. As Clara spoke, others began to rise, one by one, sharing their own stories, their own realizations. It wasn't some grand revolution that began in that moment. It was simply people coming together, acknowledging the hurt they had caused and the hurt they had endured. But just as the tides seemed to turn, Vince made his final move. He lunged forward, challenging the Black Rider to a confrontation. "You think you can change everything with your soft words," he shouted, stepping closer. "This is our town. We won't let you tear it down." The room held its breath. The tension snapped, and the crowd seemed ready to explode into chaos. But the Black Rider stood still, his eyes meeting Vince's with an intensity that was almost calm. "I'm not here to tear anything down," he replied softly. "I'm here to build something better. But that can't happen if we don't choose to be better." For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was a standoff of ideals. But then, unexpectedly, something incredible happened. One by one, the townspeople who had been on the fence, who had been silently watching the battle unfold, began to speak up. The words came slowly at first, then with more certainty. They spoke of the pain they had witnessed, the divisions they had tolerated, the fear they had harbored. And as they spoke, the energy in the room began to shift. Vince's followers wavered. It wasn't because they had suddenly agreed with the Black Rider, but because they saw something else, something powerful. They saw that they were not alone. They realized that their power, which they had once used to divide, was fading in the face of collective understanding. And slowly, one by one, they started to sit down. The mayor, Thomas Reynolds, stood silently at the back of the room, watching the change unfold before his eyes. For the first time, he realized that he couldn't hold the town together with fear. He couldn't preserve the old ways simply because it was what he had known. In that moment, he understood that true leadership meant embracing growth and change, even when it was difficult. In the end, the meeting didn't resolve everything. The town was still divided in many ways, and it would take time to heal the wounds of the past. But something had shifted. The Black Rider had done what many thought was impossible. He had shown the people of this town that they didn't have to stay trapped in a cycle of hatred and division. He had given them the gift of choice. As the meeting ended, the Black Rider quietly left, his purpose fulfilled. He didn't need recognition or accolades. His mission had always been simple: to plant the seed of unity and to show the town that they could choose a different path. The next day, things weren't perfect. People were still hesitant, still afraid. But the conversations had begun, and that was enough. The town had taken its first step toward healing, and it was a step that would not be easily forgotten. In the weeks and months that followed, the changes weren't dramatic, but they were real. Old prejudices began to dissolve, and new relationships formed, slowly, organically. People started to see each other as individuals, not as labels or stereotypes. The Black Rider, though no longer a visible figure, had sparked something deep within the town. His actions had rippled through the community, and the effects could be seen in the way people looked at each other, in the way they began to listen and understand. The Black Rider's story was not one of grand gestures or heroic battles. It was a story of patience, understanding, and quiet strength. He had shown the town that the real power was in coming together, in choosing to be better, even when it was hard. And as the years passed, the town would never be the same. The Black Rider had inspired unity not by force, but by reminding everyone that change is possible when people choose to see each other with open hearts.